What do you feel is the most difficult part about implementing diversity into booking festivals, or when you're putting together a bill?
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I kind of have a response to that. I feel like it's that conversation about access and like how do we make organizations more diverse? Well, it has to start from a place of it's like if you don't see yourself represented in a space because it's maybe made up of mostly white people, then you're not going to approach that space, you know. In Minnesota, it's hard because it feels like, even though there is a lot of stuff going on in the music scene that isn't just like white dudes playing music, like that is kind of a big portion of what our scene is made up of, because we're in Minnesota, and that's just, you know, and that's not a bad thing. But I think when it comes to booking stuff, and I'm kind of somebody who's a little newer, honestly, to this scene, but it feels like the people who have the experience, who've grown up with music in their lives, they have had access to it in a different way than maybe more marginalized communities have. So I'm not being terribly succinct about my thought on this. I think that there's also this question that I have about like, it feels like so much of the focus of this conversation is oftentimes on like the mainstream things that are happening, and how maybe the focus shouldn't be on that. It should be about like the work that's happening on the outskirts. Like, how do we lift that work up? Like, yeah, maybe the Vans Warped Tour lineup, I don't know, like isn't super diverse, but maybe that's the issue, is that we're focusing on that and not on like the smaller things that are happening. I don't know, that's not even a local thing, so it's not a very relevant, but yeah. I don't know, it's like access. Do you see yourself represented in a space? If you don't, then how do you gain access to that space? I don't know if anybody wants to piggyback on those ideas.
Have you yourself experienced being tokenized or being the person of color on a bill, and you've realized it, and how did you react to that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Especially, so being from like North Minneapolis and growing up in music, like in my family per se, opposed to like in a formatted way, like I didn't go to school for music or anything of that nature. As I started to make headway in the Twin Cities, being a female and being a woman and also a woman of color, there was a lot of that, right? Like there's only usually one woman on the bill, or like, and then one black woman on the bill, right? And there's like a rebel sense to it, right? Because you're like, I'm supposed to be here. Even if you don't see yourself represented, it's like, it's hip hop. So there's no, like, actually, like, I'm really supposed to be here, if we're being honest. But in the same sense, I think it can create dividance amongst the community, because then there are so many talented women of color in the Twin Cities that are fighting for one spot. And, you know, to be the token of the year. That's what I used to call it. I used to say that. And I still say it publicly, like with even rhyme sayers, it was like, you know, they would token one black artist a year. Like that would be kind of the artist they just get behind, male or female, and just kind of push. And then after they're done with them, then it's the next person. And you would watch that trajectory for a long time. And it became kind of like very abusive, in my opinion, for how it like developed acts, right? Like as you continue to try this. So I see, like then we talk about access or stuff like that. Like myself, I created a show called Sisters with Soul, where I put all women on the bill, because they would try to say that like, oh, women can't sell out a venue, or do you know, women don't work good together, or whatever the case was. And it was like, and then we did that, right? Like we sold out 7th Street, and we have done it now for like a few years, because it's so many talented, and just even when I think of young people, like I'm 32 now, and I got so many young people that are crafting their way in the scene and making it, and it's like, I don't want them to get stuck in that, like, that spot of, oh, I have to be, because then you can, in the abuse of it, like you like it because you're like, oh, well, I'm the one, but then when you're no longer the one, now everybody that you were the one in, you know what I mean, is looking at you like, don't try to come back over here and be in like our scene. So I think locally, like, it definitely has been an experience that I've seen, and they continue to try to do it, like at bigger events. It could be Pride, it could be all type of events where they're not curated by people and they don't understand the culture of it too. Like, if you don't understand hip hop culture, if you don't understand, you know, who you're booking and what the type of temperament of the folks that you're booking, you don't understand the culture, then you instantly like react to it, even all the way down to the bouncers and how they let acts in the door. Like, I've had issues even just getting in the door to shows I'm performing at, that it's like, that instantly makes you feel like, oh, maybe I'm not supposed to be here, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. That resonates. So again, kind of coming up in the scene through hip hop specifically, there seems to be a tendency of the institutions that have power, that have platform, to put certain artists on a pedestal. And as B-Dot was saying, that does create a weird tension, a weird dichotomy with everyone else, because now it becomes crabs in a barrel pony. It's like, oh, they got that, what's wrong with me? And so even though these artists really, as one, like we have amazing things we could do collaboratively, and then it turns into, nope, like that's the chosen one. And now all of a sudden you're put in a position where, you know, you could go from like 1 minute we're all cool, and then all of a sudden there's a lot of tension and animosity because you're the chosen one. And again, that's also just like, I think that model is not something that is inherent to like all, like the cultures that are truly represented by people who live in the Twin Cities metro area proper. So I'm not sure where that model comes from, but I think the reality is that there are a ton of really incredible artists and creators coming up that we have no idea about. Like, they're here, but they're just not getting that shine. And I think that if the attention was really given to, instead of who's gonna be the next Lizzo or the next POS, you know what I'm saying? Like, instead of finding the next, like, who's gonna be the next breakout star? It's like, no, if you develop places where young artists can authentically express themselves, develop their craft, network, like, that's where it's gonna pop from. Like, how can we not just look at what the Way was? The Way, it was a community center where people from the community could be themselves, have community gatherings, play music. Like, we act like artists like Prince and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis just magically fell from the sky. It's like, they were already here. There just happened to be access to those spaces. It's like, to me, if you could wave a wand and just like, what's the single biggest thing you could do? I just feel like if you've had more physical spaces that people from the community, from the communities that we claim to want to actually hear from and represent, had access to, we're not told how they had to use it or whatever. I think, to me, that would be a game changer, because again, if the people currently in positions of power, if the institutions don't really change much in terms of how they operate, what they look like, how can we really expect much change? That's how I feel.
Megan, do you have anything to share?
Well, I'm thinking about this thing that I feel being a woman of color where, if there's one exceptional person in your field who's really succeeding, there is this feeling of like, well, if they're doing it, then there's no space for me to do it because there's only room for one person. Like, I'm thinking specifically of somebody who's, you know, not in our community, but Japanese breakfast. So Michelle Zauner is like a half Korean woman. She wrote her memoir, which is all about her mom passing away and then really like embracing memories of her mother through Korean cooking. And like, I'm a half Korean woman and I'm sort of like, oh, well, now that she's sort of getting recognition for her identity in that way, like there isn't space for like another half Korean person to like have as much success as she has. And that's just bonkers that and I don't know if this is something that I impose on myself or that actually exists, that like for women of color, people of color, non-white people, like there's only room for there's like a scarcity mindset. I mean, that's one thing that I was kind of hearing from what you two were saying. But then also how like, yeah, really just giving, I think what it really is like just giving space over. Just like giving people space to kind of foster their own creativity and their own, it's like people don't even necessarily need, people have their own genius, their own creativity, their own voice that doesn't even need, they just need space for it to grow. And there is such a, nowadays too, with social media and everything, I mean, this is like a whole other conversation, but this focus on like, yeah, are we gonna find the next big breakout artist? Like it's hard to nurture a culture of creativity in an art scene when it feels like the focus is so much on, you know,
Sure.
are you gonna get the most numbers, the most stream, when it should be about how do we cultivate the art.
Well, so to touch on social media, I remember you making a post a few years ago now, and I might be remember it incorrectly, but I know like you commented on how whenever a journalist reached out to you, it was always a white male that wrote about your experience. So like in terms of social media, you made that post like, is social media a good place for this kind of stuff to be spoken about? And do you guys remember any social media experiences that you've used for to talk about this topic?
I think it's I mean, this is my own personal experience. I think it's a really great resource if you're able to use it in that way. For me, it's kind of hard. It just feels like a toxic place. So I have felt a lot of pressure in the past to like use that platform, but in my own personal, you know, I feel like I can advocate for people and I can show up for people in ways that don't have to happen on a social media platform. But I do think it can be a very powerful resource for, yeah.
I don't think of the internet as a place where super productive conversations usually happen.
Yeah.
They can, and again, some people might have figured that out. But yeah, me personally, I'm like, we should be having these talks in person if possible, or at least a Zoom call, at least,
Sure.
you know,
Yeah.
we can respond to each other in
Sure.
real time. But yeah, I don't know.
I think
yeah.
for me and my experience, like social media is a place, especially with like cancel culture and things of that nature. Like, I always tell my young people, like, it's a place where you can get educated or embarrassed, right? Like, those are the two spectrums that I see it going back and forth from. And the thing that I do like about social media is it shows people's inconsistencies, right? Because like you'll see like a tweet or a post or whatever about being anti something or whatever, and then in the next few weeks, then they're pro something that is very connected to what they were just preaching about being anti about. So I think social.
Do you call them out on it?
And that's another thing, like even call out culture, right? Because like I feel like to call somebody out publicly just for the sake of being able to put you on Front Street about not getting something right does nothing,
Sure.
right? Like it's like me and my friends were actually just talking about this with like, you know, when people were calling out like big institutions against like Black Lives Matter and like doing things where it's like, okay, we're not eating here or we're not going here. And it's like, then you're allowing, in a sense, social media to dictate what you care about. And for me, it's like, I would rather have an in-person conversation with somebody that maybe has, and it depends, because social also is like, there's security there, because you don't have to directly talk. Like, yeah, somebody from a music outlet could tweet and be like, oh, this BdotCroc song is trash and da-da-da, but it's like 9 times out of 10 if I see you in person, not because I'm a threat or anything like that, but it's just like, you don't have that same rapport because you're more humanized. It has dehumanized us a lot, and I feel like it changes the way we interact with each other in person. So for me, I don't, because then it's also very curated. Like social media is curated no matter what, right? Like all those tweets, all those posts, all those. So even like people's apologies after they do something wrong or whatever the case is, it's like, like you got somebody help you write that, like you articulated that a certain way. Like it doesn't feel genuine. So I think that's the thing is like, I take social media breaks. I suggest a lot of folks to do that. Like I kind of call it getting out of the matrix for a second. And as an artist, it's tough because that's where everything is promoted nowadays. But you'll realize that like, man, like if I sit here and talk, if I went and read you guys' social media, like I'm not gonna get the same interaction. There's people that I'm really cool with that I don't follow on social media because who they portray or curate on their social media platform is not who I know. So it's like, that will make me dislike you in real life and I don't wanna like, I don't wanna do that. So it's like, it's a balance. And like you said, I feel the same way. Like I think even mental health plays a big part in that too. Access, right? People are Wi-Fi, whatever. You don't even need like cell phone service. You get Wi-Fi somewhere, you just go on there and just say what you feel. And we all know like human beings feel and flow different. So I try not to be as engaged on there as I used to be, but I think it's also important to try to penetrate it because it does exist, whether we like it or not.
I feel like I would have deleted my Facebook a decade ago if I didn't need it. I feel like I needed it to promote myself or exist as a business, as an artist online. So it is a real love-hate kind of toxic relationship.
I always say, and this is parallel to social media too, I always say that who you are as a driver in a car is 10 times what you are in person, because if you're going to cut somebody off in a car, you're not going to do that in person.
Right.
You know, and social media is the same way, where it's like, oh, you have that buffer where if you're going to say something to somebody, you wouldn't say that to them in person as well. I'll share a little bit of a personal story too. I was doing merch for the artists I work with, and we were at a show out in one of the suburbs, and I had somebody come up and talk to me. They're kind of drunk, and they were talking about the Twin Cities being kind of scary. And I was like, okay, well, I'm at my job right now. I'm not gonna say anything to you that's gonna cause a scene here where my artist is playing on stage right now. So I spoke to him afterwards, and he asked me, he's like, well, when would you have those conversations? I'm like, probably here, like as we are here. So my question to you all is, if somebody, a stranger, came up to you and asked you, would you be willing to sit down to talk to me about this? Is it your job to talk to them about diversity? Would you be open to that? Or are you more apt to talk to a friend who might not understand it as well, who has a different connection to you?
I don't feel like I owe that conversation to anyone, you know, because it's labor. It's like emotional labor. I think it's probably easier to have that conversation with a stranger. It's harder to have it with people that you're closer with, I think. Kind of in the same way, or not the same way, but in a different way, where it's easier to perform to strangers, but harder to perform to your closest friends. I don't know. It really just depends on the day and how I'm feeling, You know, because I think it's important to have those conversations, but I don't think it always needs to fall on the people who are experiencing, it's like that person made you feel uncomfortable, and then maybe did you feel like you're like, oh, I sort of feel obligated to like unpack this, but I don't want to in this moment. You know, that's just like a lot for you to hold, and so I don't think you owe anybody anything. But it would be nice if in life, you know, there could be more openness, and I think sometimes it does take a little stepping out of your comfort zone and feeling vulnerable and having hard conversations for anything to really happen and move in the direction of goodness. Or just people understanding one another. But I don't feel like I ever, it's easier in this space, you know. This is like a space that's created to talk about this kind of thing, so that's nice. I don't know.
So if these people are not owed conversations, how do they learn about it then? Because it's like, you know, there's a lot of people who come and say, well, if you're not going to talk to me, how do I know even more? Like,
Yeah.
I'll just say one thing that came up. I was at the U of M for grad school in like 2018, 2019, and in my cohort, which was educators going into teaching secondary, like English language arts, essentially, we were paired up with the science cohort one day and taking some course on diversity or something about, you know, cultures and whatnot. And it was right away we realized we need to have some like real fundament about just like perspectives and the way we're talking about race and everything and equity. And we basically had to pause 2 entire class periods. We pushed all curriculum aside and it turned into like a giant circle, and essentially it turned into a space where we were like holding like literally and just sort of figuratively holding the hands of like our like white cohort members who were like crying and going through all this stuff when we suggested the notion that they might need to learn some things about race and equity and and things of that nature. And there was one situation where a young man was kind of saying like, well, you know, if I want to learn, and I'm asking you, can we have that conversation? Then like, what's wrong with that? And people kind of jumped on him for that again, saying it's not my obligation to do that. That is labor. And honestly, it's like I'm so used to that like me personally, I'm like, I could make space for that a lot of times because I'm like, I mean, I gotta see the situation and who you are and the context of everything. But like most of the times, I'm like, cool. Like if you're trying to do good and take a step forward, like I'll offer what I can. I'm certainly not the answer to enlightenment around race and equity, but yeah, I think it depends on the person and on the day. But I guess the message that young white man received from a lot of people in the classroom that day was like, that's your journey to have. You like, it's not the work of Black and brown people to sort of bring you that enlightenment. And so again, that's not a great answer to, well, if we're not having those conversations, then how do they, you know, reach that level? But I don't know, what do y'all think?
Yeah, I mean, in that situation, you're in a group of people who are in a university setting, who have access to resources, who can sort of like find answers, you know, but it just depends. If it's like somebody that you care about, if it's a family member, if it's an uncle who, you know, lives in a conservative, you know, you can make the decision about whether you want to engage in that conversation with a loved one or a family member.
Yeah.
But as far as with strangers, it's just, I don't know. It's like there are parts of yourself that you have to protect, and even though, of course, it's an important subject to you as a person because that it's like tied to your identity and who you are. It's I just don't feel like I owe anybody anything. Like there are so many resources, and it just really depends. But I think there has to be an openness on some level with people in your circle or your community. You know, I think that's the importance of community, is that maybe when it's operating at its best, there can be individuals who are a part of a community that maybe have different experiences and different perspectives and backgrounds, but you're able to have like discussion and I don't know, try to understand where people are coming from. But yeah, I don't know, that's a tough question, Youa.
And I will say too, I think you can tell if someone is like, do the work for me, or if they're like, I have a specific question and like, I would just love to know your experience and your perspective. Like that's way different to me than just kind of like, I don't know. Everyone keeps talking about this wacky, equity thing. Like, show me the way. You know, it's like you got to do a little more homework before before we have this conversation.
This wacky thing.
What's this? What are these shenanigans?
Also, as a person of color, like you get trained, you get kind of like hypnotized or trained at a very young age through the education system to exploit your experience all the time.
Sure.
So I think like that plays a big part in like the fatigue of it as you get older and you kind of find your voice and you're like, you know, it's like being in, you know, a classroom and it's Black History Month and you're like one of the only Black kids in the class or brown kids in the class and they're like, so how do we feel about Martin Luther King? And it's like, everybody kind of looks at you and you're like, I don't know, how do we feel, you know? Or like, so I think in a sense, like I ask myself, because a lot of time too, like I try to control ego in a sense and be like, yo, like I don't feel like talking about that today. And I question my intent in the conversation and the person that like you were speaking to, like what's their intentionality around asking me this question, like, because then how I react to it is gonna be different. Cause like I said, that educate and embarrass thing, like I think about those moments of like, okay, man, that was an opportunity where I could have like really educated this person and like gave them information that maybe changed the way they went on with somebody else. But if in sense I'm offended or I feel offended by what's being said, then I might embarrass them and that doesn't do any help neither because now I've proved that they're very not versed in equity or diversity or inclusion, but I did them no service neither because I completely shut them out. So they might not go ask that question again to another person. But I don't think it's our job, like we spoke to like I'm an expert of my experience, but I don't have to like educate you on my experience, like because I had to experience it. And I think there's a lot of things that come up too sometimes in those conversations, especially in universities and stuff like that, where you're like, this is a paragraph or it feels like a fictional tale for you and it's my real life, like my real identity and experience. So like, I don't get to just walk away from this conversation as just a conversation. Like you don't know what that could bring up for somebody, you know what I mean? So it's just learning your capacity too in those conversations. Like, do I have the capacity right now to have this conversation?
Yeah.
I don't, and I don't want to feel guilty about not having the capacity neither. Like,
I think it really is up to you if you're gonna call that person out or call them in.
Yep.
You know, you really have to decide that for yourself in that situation too. Why do you feel you all continue to advocate for change? And is change possible?
I think because I work with kids, like I work with young people, and like I always tell people this, like I will take young people, and now they're like my young people range to like 24, right? Like it's funny you think like 18 is the cutoff or whatever, but for myself, like seeing their optimism for the future and wanting, like desiring things, and then looking at myself as a hip hop artist that has influenced a lot of the younger like generation that's coming up from my city, is like I don't want them to experience the same things I experienced. If I can make it even a little bit easier or connect and be a resource to be like, yo, you don't have to do it this way. You can like put your own show together and find a space in your community where people that you know, understand your culture completely can come to and celebrate and things like that. Like that's really what keeps me going. Cause I feel like if you want to push forward in future, like you talk to young people, you'll get like solutions. You talk to adults, you'll get problems. Like that's just usually how it goes. Like, you know, I say that all the time. Like young people are coming with solutions, and it can be frustrating when you've been now like programmed to a certain point to only see like obstacles when they're like obstacles are like obsolete to them. They're like, yo, so who cares about that? Like we can still do this. Like, and you're like, no, you can't. But then you start to question your own youth in your head. Like, actually, you probably can actually do that way or navigate. So for me,
what changes from solutions to problems? Like, what triggers that? Do we try and reach the youth before they turn hardened and like? Yeah. Okay.
That's the goal. Like really, in a sense, like because you see it happen. Like you don't even see it happen in your own experience, right? You'd be like, oh, I'm now 25, I'm supposed to think this way, I'm supposed to feel this way, I'm 30, I'm whatever, as the age continues to go up, because ageism is a thing, right? So it's like, especially with young people of color and in the communities in which I serve, like some of them don't make it to 21. So like you're not even thinking past 16 or 18 years old. Like, so to now be 21 or 25 and still living and existing, like you're completely have a different experience than what you thought you would experience younger. So I think for me, like it's like you said, like it has to be put, like you have to continue to like nurture that youthfulness and that like optimism in a sense, or you can get cold. You can get, I always say that, like, you get bitter or you get better, right? Like, it's like, the MC in me, I always think in metaphor anyway, in words, which is how it works for me, but it's like, I think young people, like, seeing their aspirations and their goals and desires, like, that's what makes me be like, okay, I'm gonna get in this fight. Some days I'm like, oh, I'm not feeling the fight today, like, I ain't got it. But when you look at who's coming next, like, it's almost like a disservice to not want to continue.
Yeah, I just think there's so much humanity to be celebrated, so many different experiences that need to be celebrated, and I think that's what keeps me going. I'm thinking a lot about Mixed Blood Theater, which is located in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, which is a large Somali population, but also like West Bank of the U of M, and they're just an awesome theater because they do this thing called radical hospitality where 50% of their tickets are free for every production that they do. And the beautiful thing that comes from that is that, this is getting somewhere too, I promise, is that you get just a really awesome mix of people in the audience. And then you have people of all different backgrounds experiencing a unique story because their programming is also really great. And then in that experience of everybody viewing that, you learn things from the audience about how people are responding to what they're seeing. And I think in my mind, that is like the perfect example of like how transformative art can be for people, whether like you're viewing your experience on stage or not, is that we have so much to offer one another as people. Even though you might not have the same experience as somebody, you can be in that crowd watching that experience and gain so much from it. And so when I think of art operating on the highest, best level, it's when like all of our humanities are commingling in a space and we can appreciate and uplift different voices. And I think that's, why I continue to do it, because when I'm enjoying my art the most, it's when celebration is happening, and I think that's a very positive thing, and we need more positive things in our world. For sure. Yeah.
I'm also a youth worker, work at a middle school in East St. Paul, and when I listen to the news on the way into work, my spirit goes, yeah. And then when I get in the building, it's like, you know, the hope, the possibilities are endless. And so if I get to make it about myself too much, then that's when it can feel really limited and closed off. But then when I kind of remember what it's like to see the world through young eyes and just learn from them, because they have experiences that I'll never know. But the reality is that change is inevitable. And so I kind of look at it through like a sink or swim situation where I can either be part of the solution or part of the problem. I think once George Floyd was killed and the uprising happened, and the city that I kind of grew up in sort of burned down both figuratively and literally. And I felt like I came out of that, and I'm still in this phase where I'm like, I don't really recognize my home anymore. And while there is room to grieve and mourn whatever was lost or what I thought I knew and I don't know anymore, there's also the kind of the rebirth of everything, like spring, where you're just kind of like, all right, I guess I don't know anything, and now it's a whole opportunity to be like, I need to relearn what my home is and what it looks like, and especially in the music community, I'm like, these institutions are no longer there that once seemed to have so much power, and it overshadowed the entire scene in a way. So yeah, it's weird to be, I'm 41 now, so to kind of look around and say, wow, like, okay, like that place is gone, that place is gone, you know, whether it's that person is no longer there, that organization. And so it's weird, because I'm like, it's like I'm new to my own city in a way, but there's a lot of hope that can come with that, and there's a lot of change. It's like looking at a vacant lot. It's like we can either plant things there, or it's just going to fill up with whatever weeds decide to grow. So yeah, I think there's a lot of room for change, and that can be a really good thing.
Okay. So I have one last question, and then we'll open it up to Q&A if there's room. And Alexei, you touched on this a little bit too, but what advice do you have for those people or organizations that want to be advocates but don't know how to start?
I think it's okay to not know how to start and just start there. I would just say sit with that humbleness, that humility of just not knowing. And I think you just have to start to ask the question and start talking to people around you. Like, if you have a platform, if you have resources, if you have something that you feel like you could do something special with, if you could be part of that change you want to see, there are people around us in our community who have amazing ideas. And I think it's not a matter of like, if something amazing can happen, it's just like, can we find the right people? And so I'm not sure what that work looks like for any specific individual, but I just think if you're on that path of like, I want to share resources, I want to share space, I want to share power, like, it's all around you. I think you have to find those people and have those conversations. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I'm trying to think.
Right? Like, not to say the same thing, but I think it's just important. Like, it's okay to not know, right? Like, and I think immersing yourself in wherever it is that you want to do advocacy or help for is important. Like, whether that's, occupying a certain space, and just getting to know the folks in which you want to serve, right? Because I think a lot of times we want to do service and we are just viewing something from the outside looking in, but you have to really like immerse yourself in things to know like what the real need is, and ask, right? Like, how can I be of service? Figure out your resources and what skills and things you can bring to the table, because sometimes it might not even be you. Sometimes advocacy is like finding the advocate for somebody else. It's not necessarily you always having to take the position of doing that, but being like, man, I don't really specialize in that or know that, but I know somebody that does, so let me be a resourcer and a connector. I think that's a good starting point for sure. Like, in educating yourself as much as you can, like sitting in that humbleness and humility and being like, okay, like, this is where I feel I am falling short as far as understanding. How can I get that understanding, and not at the expense of the people, because it's not their job to educate you, but to be like, how can I genuinely learn from this, opposed to going into it like it's a research project or some type of data collection, because that's ingenuine, right? Mm-hmm. So just be genuine about it. Yeah.
I don't know if I have much else to add. I think it requires a bit of risk taking, yep, and a bit of like, letting other people take the lead and really allowing other people to take the lead, sure, and surrendering control. And I think a lot of really beautiful things can happen in collaboration like that. Like, I think strong leadership is important, but sometimes strong leadership requires you to take a back seat, sure, to be a good leader and allow other people to bring their experience and expertise into the room. And I think that's probably the hardest thing for people operating under larger institutions that they've maybe owned or been a part of for a long time, is like, how do you I can only imagine that it would be hard to let go of control, but I think that is the only way that things can change, because if you have such a rigid grip, mm-hmm, on something, you're not gonna evolve.
Right.
Yeah.
I did promise that was the last question, but one thing that we didn't talk on is money, because I think there's a fear of, because this money is going to be spread around more, there's going to be less for me in people of power. So it's I advocate strongly for my marginalized coworkers that don't make as much as me. I'm always like, okay, we need to be paying these people more. And I know we don't talk about that a lot, because money is a kind of taboo subject as well. And that plays a lot into when you're booking shows, I mean, I don't know if you guys have any experience with that or thoughts on that too, or...
I mean, I'll just say I transitioned out of making music my full-time job that I was like, this is how I'm gonna make a living off of, because I'm like, I give up trying to make this be my main source of money. I still love it, I still do it, I just don't have as much space for it because I'm a teacher and that takes up a lot of space. And so unfortunately recently it's become more of like, it's almost like hobby status, which is really sad to look at it that way, because it's been something that's so important to me my whole life. But I think that's a real thing, is that a lot of artists, they're like, this is not a sustainable model. Like there's just, if you're not like the cherry picked like golden child to you know, represent the city or something, it's like, I don't know how you do it. And anyone who can do it, I'm like, yo, props to you, that's amazing. But I think the money is out there. I think there are ways in which an artist wouldn't have to choose between, can I do my art or do I have to do, you know, 3 other jobs to pay the bills? So, yeah.
Do you guys have any thoughts on?
I guess I don't know. I always ask for more money.
Yeah,
My
do
band
it.
started
I mean,
working
yeah.
with a booking agent now, so he's kind of doing all that negotiating. But that's just like a thing that I'm just like, I'm just always gonna ask for more
Know
money.
your worth, yeah.
Yeah, you know, like, give me more money. What's up? And if you can't, then people will say no.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
and then it's no hard feelings.
Yep.
Yep.
But it is this really, what I'm finding as I'm trying to make a living from doing music is like, how is it sustainable? Because it seems like as money becomes more of a thing, the art and the love and the passion of it starts to get sucked out of it a little bit. So I feel like it's really hard to strike a healthy balance. I don't really know if healthy balance and being a musician are two ideas that can coexist. I feel like they're just always kind of teetering, ebbing and flowing, unfortunately. But I just think it's because it's just a very oversaturated market. There's just a lot of people doing it, and there's a lot of competition. And that sometimes doesn't always make it super fun. But know your worth and don't be afraid to ask for more. And don't be afraid to have somebody say no to you either, because that's not bad either. I don't know.
I think for myself, like, doing music full time at one point for me, like I've heard many artists say it, like it sucks the passion kind of out of it in a sense, because now you're negotiating worth, and like if you're an artist, right, like there is no real, you can't put a price on my art in real life. Like I'm really just accepting a certain amount for a certain amount of time. But I think just knowing, like, you know, exploitation exists and it's going to exist, and it's very abusive when it comes to artistry in any genre. As we watch these documentaries come out of like all these artists that were like top tier artists that we thought you're on radio and you're doing all these things and you think like income. I think really learning the business side of music is very important, because you want to know what they're paying for, right? Like it's like somebody might say, oh, you know, I'm booking you to perform on stage and just come, and it's exposure, but it's like, nah, like that exposure, be careful of that exposure word. That exposure word, and don't get me wrong, there
Great opportunity.
yeah, like it's a great opportunity, but don't get me wrong, there are opportunities that are great and can, but if you know the business of it, you'll know the difference. Like, for example, I sell a lot of merchandise for my music, so it's like some people might not even buy the music, but they buy the merch. So finding different avenues and ways to generate income, or having opportunities, like I tell people all the time, as artists with your voice, like I did radio, I've done all different types of gigs, I like hosted. So it's like you can find different avenues and ways to do money, to generate money off of your art. It doesn't have to be just the art itself, right? Like it could be the artist in a sense. So that's my thing, is like just know the difference between like exposure and exploitation, and like always ask for more, like, and ask questions about even the venues and what they're doing. How much are you charging for tickets? You know what I mean? Things like that are important, because then you can generate how much they're giving you based off of what you could really draw. And then in a sense, once you learn, like, oh, I got 50 friends to come to a show for, you know what I mean, $20 or whatever the case is, it's like, oh, well, if you could find a venue where you could, you know, maybe get 100 people in there, you know what I mean? You can get those 50 friends to come there. You're not splitting that ticket cost of 10 now instead of 20 with somebody else. You can generate that for yourself. So it's just like repetition, constant repetition.
That also just brought to mind for me something that I wanted to voice, which is that I think asking question, like I think sometimes as artists we feel like we are we have the least amount of power, but actually we have a lot of power, and you can ask questions and you can challenge bookers, institutions, whatever. Like, I guess one example is like I reached out to you about writing that feature for the large publication, and I got a little pushback actually from, they were like, oh, that's a no-no, but then they ended up getting a female, you know, I basically was like, I'd like to have like a woman, preferably a woman of color, write this feature.
Meghan, when she made that post on social media, I messaged her and I said, what you can do is ask for a person of color or a woman to write this article for you, even though their main writers are going to be 2 white males. Be sure that if there is that option to ask for it.
And I got pushback about it, but like ultimately something came of it, and I think.
But that gives opportunities to other people too. Then.
And I think we can advocate for other people as artists. We can advocate for ourselves. We have more power. And again, like sometimes people will say no, or they'll push back, and but I think challenging is always a good thing.
I've gotten much better at saying no to offers over the years, and it feels good.
It does feel
when
good.
It doesn't, when it was just not, you're like, nah, I'm good. You know, when you told me like, hey, you get to sell your own merchandise, I'm like, that's not a selling point. Like that should be obvious. Like, of course I should be able to sell my own merchandise and make money out of it. Like, what kind of money can you offer me? One last thing I wanted to add was like, so one of my groups, Kill the Vultures, happened to find an audience in Italy. So we started doing shows there about 15 years ago. I have no concept at the time. What I noticed there was that music and how musicians make a living is much different. In fact, they get state money to really make a living. Like, because there are certain countries I got to go to, like France and Italy specifically, and they just have money because they value. It seems like they just value culture and art so much so that they're like, if you can fill out this paperwork and sort of prove that you're a musician, like an active working musician. I mean, it's, you know, that can get funny too, right? Like, how many shows are you doing a year, whatever. But the fact is, if you fill out the thing and then you're just getting like a government stipend for being an artist, which is wild to think about, because I'm like, that blows my mind. You know what I'm saying? And I'm sure there's flaws with that too. I'm not saying that's like creating a utopia, but to me, it seems like we could generally say in America too, like maybe, like why is it we don't seem to really appreciate the arts and culture enough to put like money into it and be like, we're going to make sure that artists are stable and don't have to work 2-3 jobs just so that they can keep doing their art. So that's something to think about too. It's like even at the state level or whatever, it's like if there could be more funding. You know, we have a surplus in the state now, right? Like, you mean to tell me we can't get any funding for artists to do their thing? We have to, it's either like grants that are awarded to X amount of people. I'm like, that's cool, I'm glad those are there, but I'm like, come on, there's gotta be another way.
There's more.
Thank you all for that topic too. And the reason why I bring it up is because if we're talking about making places more diverse, offering low-income neighborhoods that don't have opportunities to be, hey, you can be a musician, is to pass along that money and to share it so they can have opportunities, and then it becomes a community versus we're tokenizing you. So I do think we have time for questions. And if anybody has questions, I'll probably repeat so for streaming purposes.
Okay, I have a question. First of all, thank you for making space to talk about this, and especially for giving us space to ask you all some questions. So Nate and I, we are bookers. We book a lot of festivals, a lot of larger bill shows and venues. And there's so much gatekeeping and booking that my question is about that access to bills. And, you know, for us, this was mentioned earlier, like, we really value other artists, especially artists of color, advocating for other bands for us to like try and book and like connect with and reach out with. And that process has been valuable to us, like to just have conversations with people about the bills we're putting together. But we're finding that, like, especially our city government, they think the answer to access is by having an application, right? Like, here's the application to apply, to be a part of this series or be a part of this bill. And I'm wondering, from the perspective of a musician or from management, you know, what's your preference, and those applications or those kind of hidden bills that are being created, how do we get, if there is an application, into, you know, different communities, right? I feel like when the applications go out, they're going to the same people. The same people are applying all the time. We're never getting like new artists or maybe even a more diverse lineup of artists applying to those things. And so when the lineups come out, I'm like, did you guys curate it, or was it just the same people that applied? And I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on those different processes and how we kind of do provide access in our booking.
Sure. So the question is, if there's an application process for a festival, how do we get that application out to bigger communities or different audiences or different communities as well? I mean, go ahead.
Well, there's a part of me that's like, how would you do that? But then there's the other part of me that's like, is it that hard to just like Google, you know what I mean? Like just Google, like, I don't know, just Google anything and just like find different organizations and just send, you know, I think.
There's a few organizations like Springboard, you can send to them to say, can you pass this along to your newsletter group or people
I guess maybe the tail end of that question is like, do you prefer that? Do you like applications? Do you not like applications? Would you rather deal with us as bookers just up front, you know? Or do you like applications?
So I have two feelings about it. I have two feelings about it. I think I see the necessity of it, like the need to have an application. I think one of the barriers, in sense, that I've even faced as an artist, and also being a person that's been like in the education system, like it can feel very, how do you say that? Like it creates that barrier of like, I have to prove that I deserve to be in this space, and I remember talking to, like, if you think of even like South by Southwest or just some of those festivals that have that, it creates such a like, I have to prove myself. And I get it, like, because there's a need in senses if you are an artist to prove that your art is of value and you want to display it, right? But I think some of the questions, or maybe even having like, and I've seen people do it now for sure, where they'll like do like a seminar before the application or something, where they'll do like a, you know, if you have questions about the application, need help filling out the application and things like that. But I think that barrier of like, oh, now I have to fill out this form. And then also like maybe you've done a few years of filling out the form and you're not getting selected, so then that discouragement happens too. Like, I think it's a balance of both of those things for sure. And I know with young people, when I encourage them like, yo, go fill it, like, it's like almost the next step thing where it's like, I don't want to do that. Like, I'm not doing that. So I don't know. I feel like they're needed for sure, but I think there could be a better way of maybe marketing it, or maybe, like, I feel like after a certain amount of questions, you kind of just feel like it's repetitive and you're like, like, if you're not chosen for this, do you still want to subscribe? And get like, no, I don't. If I don't get chosen, like those type things. And have another, I think having artists help too, like in sense, because you do see the same people get curated on the same bills. So then you're like, well, what's the point, right? Like, and that's not even just in the application process for festivals. That's with grants. That's with a lot of these different things where I think like that system of I need to exploit myself and sell myself, like, you know, do you have a story to tell? Like those type of questions where it's like, I just want to do my art. Like, I don't really want to have to like tell my mom was a single parent, like that whole vibe. It feels real like exploitive in times.
Yeah, and it's uncharted territory for a lot of folks, especially if you're trying to really open it up and be like, let's get some new voices in here. And so, yeah, maybe it's one thing that could go a long way is like, in the same way that you might create a social media campaign to promote the festival itself, could there be a campaign where it's like, we are having a seminar, like we're going to show you how to apply to even get in here. Like, you can make a whole event out of like, a, you know, we'll have food and beverages here, we'll have maybe some entertainment. We're gonna, you know, really open it up to various communities where it's like, no, the whole point is we're going to show you how to fill out this application and like kind of walk through that process. Because I think unless you really kind of go out of your way to be like, no, I'm serious, like we want you in this space, I think it's going to continue to feel like either a barrier that it's too uncomfortable to even get to the front door to knock, or it's just invisible and it's not even known that the door is there in the first place, you know. Yeah.
Maggie, what's the name of your festival that you guys book?
We run Midwest Music Festival.
Oh, Midwest Music Festival.
Yeah, so fairly large, and then we also book throughout Rochester and Winona. So
Got it.
yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, we will share it here, obviously, on the
Of
stage.
course. Yeah, thank you very much.
I was gonna ask too, is it, there can be a, and I know that can go either way, right? Because you want acts back too, but like a competitive sense to it, where like you select a certain amount of new applicants a year or a festival.
Yeah.
That makes a difference too, because then it's like, oh, like I know I'm new, so I have that edge way versus like somebody, and I think about that with grants too. They do it with grants too, obviously, but like it makes it more appealing, because then it's like, oh, not the same people are gonna get it. Like I'm a new applicant, so I have a higher percentage chance of like getting through that process than like somebody that knows how to write a festival application. Like those people that got those copy paste, like they're sending out 20 applications a year, like easy, no problems. Like making it maybe competitive too in that way.
Yeah.
And I guess on like an extension of that too, like especially in the Midwest, like the applications aren't really the end all be all, because we have like I'm one of the main curators for the festival, so like if we have any gaps or things, I try to like search out, make sure we have like a good lineup across the board. If we get like, you know, a bunch of like dudes and guitars, I'm not going to book a festival that's exclusively dudes on stools. So you want to kind of like focus on that. But something that I like have a lot of thoughts about when I'm booking like just in your normal shows or day fests or things is like, how can I make sure that I'm like holding myself accountable at being like making sure I'm having diverse bills, because I don't want to end up like tokenizing people or tokenizing a bill like this is the hip hop night or something like that, or at the same time, because like I try to make sure that I don't book any shows that are exclusively white men.
Gotcha.
But at the same time, like on the flip side, if I have a white male band and I have someone with actual representation, is that inherently tokenizing? And it's something like, how do I hold myself accountable to doing that and making sure that I'm providing, you know, equitable spaces for any?
So the question is, how does he hold himself equitable for not tokenizing?
I don't know if this is the best model, but it's just one. So yeah, I feel like this conversation I've had a lot more in theater spaces, so that's why I'm kind of just like bringing up all the theater experience. But there are theaters, and I think it's the Guthrie in particular, that made like a statement. They're like, all of our casting, or maybe it was Theater Latte Job, but whatever, it's like, we're gonna make sure no matter what, that when we're casting, at least 50% of the cast is non-white. So I mean, it could be something like that, where no matter who you're booking, you're just making sure that there's a balance between like, I don't know if I think that's the best way. I don't know what I think about it, to be honest, but it's just an idea, a model that other people that I know are using in their organizations.
Is it Nate?
Yeah.
Nate, I think it's okay to make mistakes. Don't be scared to. We're all human, and I think working towards there is better than not even making the effort. And I mean, if you're comfortable in asking others, then ask for feedback. But as you're pushing for it, I think that's great.
Can I ask a question to you? Like, because I've always wondered why on a night of music does it have to be like 3 bands that are all kind of the same? Like, do you feel that it's hard to sell a show that has a hip hop artist, a rock band, and then like a shoegazy, you know what I mean? Like, I always want more of that, to be honest.
Yeah.
Just like more diversity in the genre of music that you see on a bill in a night.
I think you could argue kind of both ways. Like a lot of what like my creation tends to be more focused on like how do I create a bill where like A leads into B, leads into C very well. Because typically like you'll have fans who are coming for, the third band, but the first two bands will still be somewhere within the wheelhouse of what they want to do. With like a day fest style thing where I have enough slots for like 8 bands or something, like that gives me a lot more opportunity to kind of fill that out with some niche stuff. It's the same thing like Midwest Music Fest, where it's not like I don't have to have all 60 bands fit the same vibe.
Yeah.
I can have jazz punk go into hip hop, go into jam bands. Like you can do that pretty easily. But with like single like shows, I've found that it can be harder. You'll have people like skip the first 2 bands to just come for the third one, or they'll come for just the first band, and you have 2 bands who are sitting there with like a third of the crowd that they thought they were going to have.
Yeah.
So it's trying to find that, it's a tricky balance.
Yeah,
to do,
totally.
I guess. And that's why I like doing like bigger day things. I've been doing a lot with like Fusion Gear Project down in Rochester. It's been huge for that because they really focus on like music scene things, and they're like, yeah, we just do a whole day, just fill it up and just do whatever you want. And I'm like, that's great, because then I can just like pad it out with as many different things, and then people can come in and go as they please. And most bands aren't expecting that the people that are coming in at noon are going to stay till 1 necessarily. So, but I mean, it is a tricky thing because I like niche lineups, but sometimes it can be this weird thing where it's like you can't. It's hard, especially with like shoegaze stuff. Like it's hard to sell that when you have like bluegrass afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No.
We have
That was great. Please, if you have more questions too,
Oh my gosh. I guess my other question was about accessibility of audiences, and you mentioned the free program or 50% free program for theater, and we try to do almost all of our stuff free. Like if we can, we do it free, right? And I don't know, I guess maybe it's sometimes like which artists we have bring different crowds. But sometimes I want just like a more diverse audience for it to also be enjoying the types of music. And I guess I just don't really know how to market stuff in that way. Like
booking music, like PSC music, but the crowd is entirely white.
Which happens a lot in our town, right? Because we're in Rochester. And so we're like, this is weird, right? Like, I don't know. I guess it's maybe just a thought, but if you have any thoughts about that, like just kind of accessing different parts of the
How do you like do outreach into different communities for promotion?
For
of things,
promotion, right.
to get more people into the door, not necessarily from like a working perspective, but from a person who wants to be entertained, wants to be in a space. Like, how do we create those spaces?
Yeah.
So the question is, how do we create spaces for a more diverse audience as well?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So our band did 2 nights. This was like years ago. It was like right after Crazy Rich Asians came out. So we did a Crazy Broke Asians night, and we got like Asian, and it's just funny because my band is me and then 4 white dudes. So it's like every night the white men on stage were still like, there was like more white men on stage than there were Asian people. But we did it both times at 331 Club. And yeah, I remember just being like, it's really hard to like feel the celebration of what we're trying to do with this, because most of the people in the audience are white, and then it just feels like this weird like, it's like me and Diane and everybody gets us confused with each other, which is another problematic thing. So side note for everybody watching, like I am not Diane Miller.
I accidentally called Diane Megan once. Not
It's
because,
okay.
Because her friend Megan was sitting next to her at that time, and I'm like,
yeah.
I'm like, she's like, that's not.
Yeah, but yeah, it's like I think there are so many things you have to think about. You have to think about like the artists that you're curating on stage, but then how are you also like how are we thinking about who we're bringing in and how we're bringing them in, and how to I don't know. That's a hard question.
My thought goes to, do the people from the communities you want to see at the festival, do they want to be there? is there an act, you know what I'm saying? Like, so I wonder if there could even be like, you know, we could make space, a little opening thing. We want to see someone from your community get up, do a little thing, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, like we got a reason to show up and support someone that we know. But I get, I don't know. I don't have the answer, but my mind kind of goes to like almost like a survey thing where I'm like, do you just go into these space and be like, yo, we would love to see you at our festival. What's your experience when you think of this festival? What comes to mind? Because it might be like, I don't know. Like that's where we would think of that as like more of a white space. We don't feel as comfortable going there. That's cool that you like us to be there. These are some things we'd love to see at this festival. Like it might be, you might get very direct information about how to kind of make those changes. I know there was a local festival that, you know, I think predominantly had a pretty white audience, and this was probably 4 or 5 summers ago now, but they intentionally gave away like hundreds of tickets. I'm trying to think how they specifically got them in the hands of Black and brown people, but it might have been straight up to like a local BLM chapter or something, but they're just kind of like, please, like take these tickets, like, let me know if you need something else. But so I don't know, you might have to get a little creative and just think about how can we invite other people into the space. But I think the first question might just be like, do X communities, like, do they want to be here? Is this a place they would like feel comfortable at? And if not, why? How, you know, can we make those changes?
And I think another thing, just to, I don't know location wise, but I always think about that with festivals. Location is important too. When it comes to certain demographics, being able to like access and get to the space. Transportation. Because I remember for even with me doing sound set before, it was like there was no way I was going all the way out the shot, like for what I had never even, I didn't even know it existed and it was out there, you know what I mean, to be honest. And then I remember them one year doing like incentivizing, like, so they went to like, you know, the YMCA and different like orgs in the community and like gave away a lot of tickets. And it's like, okay, they got tickets, but like how they gonna get there? Like these kids don't know, you know, these parents can't get them from there to there and back. So I think that too of like, okay, like what are some of the obstacles that could possibly be in the way of them just showing up, you know what I mean? Because that's a thing too, for sure.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions?
Well, I just had a comment related to that. I also think it's really important, like you said, to reach out like, to the YMCA. So I think reaching out to activists and leaders in the communities you want to see, to get those people, because they have the connections you want. So I think connecting with them and being like, hey, what does your community want to see? I'm interested in bringing in more people. Do you have any suggestions for me? And getting those answers, because those people in those leadership positions want to see that. They want people to be asking those questions because they want to help their community to get to the places and experience the play parts and whatnot.
And be very strong on your why. Why is important. Like, why do you want us in this space? Like, what is the reason in which we need to be occupying the space? Because we all know too, like with diversity and inclusion comes money. So it's like, people be like, oh, I'm able to get this crowd there, so now I'm able to fund and show you, look, I told you we're diverse. And then the next 5 years, it's not that. So it's like, just knowing your why too is important when you're trying to get people to come.
So I think we're at time, but I do want to say one last thing before we're done too. I watched a documentary a few years ago called Little Big Farm, and it was 2 people who were starting a farm. They didn't know what to do, but they realized that biodiversity is what would make the farm thrive. So they had all kinds of plants, all kinds of animals, all kinds of insects would visit because of that, versus mono farming, which is all just one type of crop. And I think, not to sound like very hippy dippy or anything, but I think humans hopefully will eventually get there in how we act, how we think towards each other. So that's my hope. So I want to thank you all, Alexei, Casselle, Meghan Kreidler, and BdotCroc.
Appreciate
Thanks
for
everyone.
having us.
Thank you.